It's a great pleasure to be here with you at last, after the difficulties caused by Storm Doris last week. And I'd love to talk to you about theories of student support for retention. And in particular, I wanted to talk about theories of learning motivation in distance education. I have to confess straight away, I'm not a psychologist. My original degree was in theoretical physics a long time ago. I was in theoretical physics not because I was particularly intelligent, but because in the laboratory, instruments used to melt and explode whenever I came near. So they thought I'd be much safer if they put me in a room with a paper and pencil and kept me away from the laboratory altogether. But it did give me an interest in theory and in all kinds of theories. Now, I know I've shown this graph before quite a number of times, I suspect, and you may well have seen it several times. But one of the features of this graph is that shows that there is a distinct difference between conventional education, with graduation rates in the UK at least around 80%, and distance education, where the graduation rates, the ones here in red, are much lower. I wondered for a long time why that should be. Was there a particular theory that actually explained it? And I was particularly interested in theory because there's a couple of quotes about it. Theory without practice is sterile. Practice without theory is blind, which is possibly due to another theory that I think is really another quote about theory is due definitely from Kurt Lewin, the American sociologist, who said, "There is nothing so practical as a good theory." So when I looked for theories about distance education, I discovered there wasn't a great deal. There's Professor Michael Moore's theory of transactional distance, which suggests that it's the isolation of distant students, that is, from other students, their tutors, and the institution, which is a principal factor in their dropping out. But why then would that happen? What theory of motivation might explain it? Well, a number of years ago, I was at a conference in California, which I have to say was very lively, all about student retention. Do we want student retention, brothers and sisters? Yes, we sure do, was the theme of the conference. And there was a speaker there, a Professor Edward Anderson, who suggested that if you want to increase retention, you should actually build on that, because most students drop out because of reduced motivation. And there's a number of other comments which I also found, which I thought were also interesting. There's a very old one from the English educationalist John Lubbock, who said the important thing is not so much that every child should be taught, as that every child should be given the wish to learn. In other words, the motivation to learn. And a much later comment from Professor Paul Ramsden, who said, no teacher can ever be certain that their teaching will cause a learner to learn. I began to wonder whether in focusing on teaching in distance education, perhaps I was missing something. So I thought, can we find out what actually motivates distance students to learn? Can we help them enhance that motivation? And equally importantly, keep it going? Because in the end, there's a lot of thinking from current educational psychologists that it's not so much intellectual ability that keeps people learning, it's practice and perseverance. Well, if that was the case, then there are two aspects to consider about learning motivation. One is, can you write distance texts that is motivational? And can you offer support that is motivational? So the thing to do, I thought, was to look for learning motivational theories. I found there's rather a lot of them. This is just a sample of some of the learning motivation theories I found. Some of them were perhaps a little out of the ordinary. I was at a conference where they were discussing the theory about belief in a just world, because they discovered that students with a high level of belief in a just world were getting better assignment grades. But then someone else in the conference stood up and said, well, if you were getting better assignment grades, wouldn't you believe that it was a just world? And that is the problem with some of these theories, is that they don't really seem to give you an insight in how you might enhance people's motivation. So anyway, some of them were better than others in that respect. For instance, I particularly like Sheldon's self-concordance model. Sheldon says that there are actually 4 types of learning motivation. There's intrinsic motivation, which is, as you would expect, driven by outside forces, the need to get a degree, the need to get better earnings and so on. And then there's introjected motivation, which is all about avoiding guilt and trying to get rid of anxiety. Then there's identified motivation, where you subscribe to the values underlying the thing that you're actually doing. And finally, there's intrinsic motivation, where you're driven by curiosity and the sheer pleasure of what you're doing. What Sheldon says is that identified and intrinsic motivation are much more important for learning than extrinsic or introjected motivation. And I realized that this is actually true in my own experience, because a number of years ago, my wife persuaded me to go to the gym with the extrinsic motivation that really I needed to get fit, and perhaps the introjected motivation, I was feeling guilty about putting on weight. Unfortunately, I never really quite identified with the values of the gym, all that huffing and puffing on those machines, and I certainly never actually enjoyed it. I never actually got any intrinsic motivation out of it. With the inevitable result that I dropped out and have never gone back. Oh well, never mind. There are other theories of motivation. Another one that I think is quite interesting from our point of view is self-determination theory. This theory is actually quite congruent with Sheldon's theory. It says that intrinsic or self-motivations are much more important than extrinsic motivations. And apparently, these days, self-determination theory is the theory that's often used in sports coaching. Basically, what it says is that in order to succeed, you have to have 3 things. You have to have competence. You have to feel that as you increase your competence, that increases your motivation. You have to have autonomy, control over your learning. And finally, there needs to be some kind of relatedness. a relationship in your learning with a person who actually cares about your learning. That struck me as interesting because it seemed to me that in distance education, that's often the real weakness. Relatedness seems to be the most difficult thing to achieve in distance education. Well, these theories were helpful, and I think they gave me a few insights into why learning motivation was important and why students without that motivation tended to drop out, just as I dropped out of the gym. But there was still a problem. The problem was that these theories didn't really explain how you might change people's learning motivation. As Karl Marx used to say, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So I thought I would start to look for theories that might suggest ways in which you could switch up or enhance students' learning motivation. Here are some of them that I found. There's John Keller and his arcs theory of motivation, Carol Dweck and his self theories, John Sweller's cognitive load theory, John Hattie and his self-reporting theory, and Martin Seligman, who is the founding father of positive psychology, the psychology that seeks to explain why people are happy rather than why they are miserable. I have to say, although he's the psychologist of happiness, I've never found a picture of him smiling, but maybe he does in secret. Let's look at these in turn and see what we might be able to get from them. Start with Keller's theory. Keller's arcs theory relies on attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. He says the important thing about motivation is getting students' attention and keeping students' attention. And he suggests things like using humour and empathy are the most important things. Then whatever you do must be relevant to what students see as their needs. So you have to reduce distraction. And there's confidence, giving students confidence, rather like self-determination theory, perhaps. The more confidence you have in your competence, the better you will do. We did a little survey a few years ago, a colleague and myself, and we asked our Open University students what they most wanted from their tutors. And the two things they came back with were expertise and something we called approachability. That is, they wanted their tutors to be experts in the subjects they were teaching, but they also wanted them to be easy to approach and easy to talk to. This is hardly surprising. I guess these are qualities that you'd really want in your doctor, wouldn't you? But I thought that that was interesting in that sense. And finally, there's satisfaction, giving students lots of feedback so that they know they are achieving. There's quite a lot more to this theory, but that last item relates to something else from Professor John Hattie of Auckland University in New Zealand. Professor Hattie undertakes meta-surveys. What he does is he looks at educational research from all over the world to see if he can draw general conclusions. And he's done a very wide range of various things. I think his research currently encompasses something like 30,000 students and 400 different studies. And he's looked at all these different actions that can affect learning. all the way from student self-assessment all the way down to outdoor adventure programs, as you can see. What Hattie discovered was that the most important thing that kept students motivated was something that he called self-reporting. Students should know how well they're doing. In other words, they should be getting self-generated feedback. That's a little different from assessment. It means they need lots of opportunities as they're studying to check how well they're learning. Then there's Sweller's cognitive load theory. Sweller says that it's all about the transfer of learning. Your initial learning goes into your working memory, where it is stored only briefly. Your working memory is where you put the question of what did I just go into the kitchen to get? Or in my case, definitely doesn't last very long. The importance of this is that what's in your working memory needs to be transferred to your long-term memory in order for you to actually have learned something. Now, I don't quite understand Sweller's theory. It gets very complicated in various ways, talking about the cognitive load of various different kinds of learning. But what he does come out with, which struck me as interesting, is that to increase the efficiency of working memory, one of the simplest ways of doing it is to use worked examples. I found that quite interesting because when I looked at some of the Open University material that I'd been teaching, there seemed to be a huge resistance to giving students examples of what they should do, particularly in literary subjects. For instance, many times students are asked to write an essay, but without actually being given an example of what a good essay might look like. I thought that that was quite interesting, in fact. Then the other finding from Sweller's theory is that you should reduce the working memory load. In other words, you should avoid redundancy and presenting concepts in too many ways. This kind of relates to Keller's theory as well, but the problem is if you're writing online text, then there's so many different things that you might be able to put into it. There are forums, pencasts, blogs, video clips, wikis, audio clips, podcasts. There's no end to all the different things you can put into your online text. But if you put too much in, then you're going to run into problems with the working memory load, according to Sweller. Too much redundancy and things will fall apart. I found this in the OU a number of years ago. I was teaching a course on the technology of music, which is all about how musical sounds are produced, how CDs work, and so on. And it was clear that the people writing the course were so enthusiastic about the subject that they just put in everything they could. All the video clips, the blogs, the audio clips, everything that they could think of, they put into the course. We called it course exuberance syndrome. And the problem was, of course, that it was hopelessly overloaded, and in the end, it had to be withdrawn. So if I'm writing a course, I try to put in things like personal experiences. I try to acknowledge that students might be finding things difficult. I put in lots of feedback opportunities, lots and lots of worked examples, as well as pictures, jokes, cartoons, stories and poems and games. This doesn't always work, I have to say. A few years ago, I was asked to help write a MOOC about maths in America, or math as they call it there. So I duly found quite a lot of mathematical jokes which I put in, but sadly the Americans didn't like my jokes and they took them all out. So perhaps it's just a different sense of humour, but I think there was also a kind of feeling that somehow learning ought to be serious. Actually, I don't think that's the case. I think we should try and make learning fun and funny. Of course, here I'm actually, in a sense, I have to be aware of redundancy. I must be careful that I don't put in things that are not relevant. So if I put in a picture or a joke, I must make sure that it's about whatever is being studied. My next theory is one due to the American psychologist Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck has written a book called Self-Theories, and perhaps the best way to illustrate this is to ask you a couple of questions. Question one is, you have a certain amount of intelligence and can't do much to change it. Is that true or false? Question two is, you have X% of intelligence and Y% of effort contribute to success. In other words, what's most important, your intelligence or your effort? And give values for X. Let's see what Dweck says about the answers to the questions herself. What she says, in effect, is that if you said true to question one and your value of X is greater than Y, you may be what she calls an entity theorist. If you said false to question one and your value of X was less than Y, you may be what she calls an incremental theorist. What do these terms mean? Oh, and by the way, when I've done this sometimes in various places, I have to remind people that the value of X plus Y should actually be 100. But I know this very nice online maths course they can take if it didn't. Let's see what she means by these terms. Okay, Dweck says that entity theorists believe that intelligence is fixed and cannot be altered through effort, whereas incremental theorists believe that your intelligence is actually malleable and you can change it through effort. What Dweck says further is that entity theorists will study well, but when they encounter difficulties or failure, they may tend to believe that they've reached the limits of their intelligence and they may tend to give up. Incremental theorists, on the other hand, will see failure and difficulties as reasons just to try harder. And Dweck tested her theory in a school in New York with a control group, and she persuaded or taught a group of students that their theories of their intelligence was incremental, it was malleable and could be changed by extra effort, and she found that they did better than students who were just simply told about intelligence and the brain. And that what happened was that these interventions, as she called them, were very simple, and yet they had a long-lasting effect. Students went on believing that they could do better through effort for a long time afterwards. This theory is now really quite common around various places and has been worked on quite a bit. And I think it's really quite persuasive in many ways. Certainly there's quite a lot of evidence to support it. And let's look at positive psychology. This is Professor Seligman's theory of positive psychology, the psychology of happiness, flow, and above all, strengths. There's a neat little book by an old colleague of mine, Ilona Honeywell, Positive Psychology in a Nutshell. That's a very accessible read if you want something to get hold of. What Honeywell says is that what you should be doing is looking for strengths that can overcome weaknesses, and that you should praise effort rather than achievement. This sounds a bit paradoxical, but for instance, I remember talking to a new student at the Open University who was a single mother with 2 children, and she was really lacking confidence. She wasn't at all sure that she was going to be able to manage to study. But I said to her, look, you know, if you're bringing up 2 children as a single mother, then I bet that you've got some really good organizational strengths. You must be able to organize your life really well. Well, being well organized is a terrifically useful strength for study. It will be enormously helpful to you. So instead of seeing her situation as weakness, I try to reframe it as a strength. The second thing is that you should praise effort rather than achievement. This is directly from Carol Dweck's studies. If you praise achievement all the time, then when a student runs into difficulties, they may assume they've reached the limit of their intelligence and give up. But if you praise effort, it's actually more likely that students will continue to keep trying. Honeywell actually produced a list, what she called her strengths approach to student support at my request. It was a 9-point plan to strengthen what she called social identity. I won't go through all these points because we don't really have the time, but I think if you look at them, you'll see that they're actually the sorts of things that a really good teacher will probably do quite naturally. Look at the positive, focus on students' existing strengths, look at their past successes, and encourage their hope and ambitions. Look at their values, goals and motivation, get them to talk about their life story. Look at the resources they've got to hand. Validate effort rather than achievement. But only when you've done that should you look at their uncertainties, their fears, and their lack of skills. Interestingly, I noticed the other day that this approach is actually being used by a University of Buckingham in the UK. They've got Martin Seligman in. You know, he still doesn't look very happy, does he? But anyway, to actually make their university a positive university by using positive psychology to actually increase their students' success. That'll be an interesting experiment, and I shall follow that with interest. We shall see. Finally, of all these approaches, there is one last one that is, well, it's only just happening, and I don't know much about it. It's called WPI, Wise Psychological Interventions. And this is a direct quote that says, recent reviews reveal numerous brief social psychological interventions designed to leverage motivational processes that increase student learning. I think what they mean is the little interventions that keep students motivated. There was an article last year in the New Scientist about this, but at the moment I've not necessarily been able to find very more. There is an article in the Review of Educational Research that, rather like John Hattie's idea, looks at a whole range of different interventions to see how effective they are. You'll see some of these are actually already a bit familiar to us, like the self-determination theory, but I'm not really necessarily sure what these others particularly mean. I know, for instance, that expectancy value is all about students being on the right course for themselves. Achievement goals are all about having goals that are challenging but achievable, and so it goes on. I need to find out a lot more about these. So watch this space. Right, well, there's one last thing that I think is important to know, and that goes back to Professor Anderson again. I think I've said this before, but Anderson says basically waiting for students to contact us, in other words, student self-referral, does not actually work as a mode of promoting persistence. Students who need services the most refer themselves the least. So if you want to take effective retention action, then you have to take the initiative to reach out to students. Or as the researcher Bogdan Bean says, you must reach the quiet student. Gosh, well, we've come a long way. Let me finish by just putting these theories together for a moment. I think they fall into two groups. There's the kind of cognitive psychological theories. These are your epistemological identity theory, in other words, ensuring students are on the right course for them. Achievement goal theory, as I say, setting challenging but doable tasks. The self-concordance model, making learning enjoyable. Keller, being approachable, empathizing with students' difficulties. And Hattie and Sweller, who talk about the need for a lot of feedback and worked examples. And then there's what I think of as the social and positive psychology theories, persuading students of the importance of effort and praising effort rather than achievement, from Carol Dweck. Honeywells emphasizing student strengths rather than weakness, and taking a personal interest in students, which fits in very well with Bessie and Ryan's students needing someone who cares about them, and with Anderson's being proactive and intervening. I recently came across an article in the unlikely place of a marketing magazine, which was all about, do relationships matter in predicting how well first-year students will transfer to their second year? And the idea certainly was that actually the better the student had relationships with their teachers, the more likely they were to carry on. Well, that's an awful lot of psychological models. I sometimes think that perhaps the simplest model is just getting your mothers involved, but obviously we need a great deal more research. And there's another question, which is, what actually motivates us? I just saw this cartoon, which I found several years ago, but seems even more timely than ever. I think that what motivates us is as important as what motivates our students. And I have a colleague from Scotland who says that actually, when you think about it, the biggest barriers to increasing retention is actually the institution itself. What does she mean by this? Well, she says that institutions or people in institutions fall into three different groups. She says, first of all, there's the Darwinistas. Darwinistas believe that students drop out because they're not intelligent enough, or they're just unmotivated or lazy. They see their job as weeding out the unfit, the students who aren't going to make progress anyway. I think they're the kind of entity theorists in distance education. Then there's what I think of as the fatalistas. They argue that students drop out for reasons beyond our control. And they're doomed to pass or fail, and there's not much we can do about it. Fatalistas will make lots of effort to do the best possible teaching they can, but in the end they say, well, it's entirely up to the students. I think, again, that they are entity theorists. Finally, I like to think that there's a third attitude to student retention. It's what I think of as the retentioneer. Retentioneers most often students most often drop out because of the lack of proactive support, retentioneers think. And they see their job as helping students to be as successful as they can be. In other words, not to judge what students can achieve, but to help them be the best they can be. I think they're incremental theorists. I have a little bit of proof of this theory, which comes from a really very unusual source. These are the British Royal Marines, who a few years ago were having real difficulties with retention on their training program. They were recruiting young men to their training program who were then dropping out in large numbers long before they could graduate as a Royal Marine. So the Royal Marines pulled in a psychologist who tried to look at what was happening. And the psychologist discovered that the tutors on the program, the sergeants, the sergeant majors and the others, were saying that we need these young men to be the best possible soldiers. And the psychologist tried to change their attitude to these young men don't need to be the best possible soldiers, they need to be the best that they can be. As a result, apparently retention in the Royal Marines has actually changed quite a lot and is much better than it used to be, and is saving a great deal of money as well. That's pretty well it from me. Just to say that you will find other things in my book, and there's some articles on my website that you might find helpful. And thanks very much for watching.